The blood was still dripping from Staff Sergeant Mike "Radar" Sullivan's hands when the last official search plane returned to base without finding a trace of his brother's downed B-24 bomber. For 6 hours, Mike had been frantically rewiring damaged radar equipment with shrapnel-torn fingers, refusing medical attention while German artillery shells exploded just 300 yards from his makeshift workshop. The Army had officially declared Lieutenant Danny Sullivan's crew missing and presumed dead after their bomber disappeared over enemy territory during a supply drop mission. But Mike wasn't giving up. Not on Danny. Not when he knew something every radar expert in the Pacific Theater had missed, that standard search patterns only covered 60% of the crash zone because military radar couldn't penetrate the electromagnetic interference created by the volcanic mountains of Luzon Island. Mike had 2 hours of battery power left, a collection of salvaged radar components that shouldn't work together, and one desperate plan to build a radar system that could see through the electromagnetic chaos and find his brother before Japanese patrols did. What happened next would defy every principle of radar technology, challenge the limits of brotherhood and determination, and prove that sometimes love and desperation can achieve what millions of dollars in military equipment cannot. If stories like this move you, hit that subscribe button. These accounts show how far one person will go when everything they care about is on the line. The Japanese artillery shell that changed everything exploded at 0347 hours on November 15, 1944, just 50 feet from the radar station where Mike Sullivan was calibrating the search equipment that was supposed to guide his brother's B-24 bomber safely back to base after a supply drop mission over Japanese-occupied territory in the Philippines. The 150mm shell hit with the force of a lightning bolt, sending a shockwave that cracked the concrete walls and blew out every light bulb in the bunker. Mike was thrown backward against the reinforced wall, his head slamming into the steel door frame with a sickening crack. Blood immediately began flowing from a deep gash across his left hand where flying shrapnel had torn through flesh and muscle, exposing bone underneath. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the horror Mike felt as he watched sparks cascade from the damaged radar console like a deadly fireworks display. Vacuum tubes exploded in showers of glass. Critical wiring harnesses burned with the acrid smell of melting copper and rubber. The main power transformer sparked and died with an electrical scream that meant the primary radar system was completely destroyed. Through the ringing in his ears and the taste of blood in his mouth, Mike heard the voice he'd been dreading all night. The radio operator announcing in flat, official tones that Lieutenant Danny Sullivan's bomber had failed to reach its designated rendezvous point and was officially listed as missing in action. Negative contact with Liberator 77, the radio crackled through damaged speakers. Aircraft is now 43 minutes overdue. Weather conditions deteriorating. Search operations suspended until daylight hours. Crew status, missing, presumed dead. Mike wiped blood from his eyes and stared at the smoking wreckage of equipment that was supposed to have brought Danny home. The N/TPS-1 radar set lay in ruins, its sophisticated components scattered across the bunker floor like the fragments of his hopes. But as Mike struggled to his feet, fighting waves of dizziness from the head impact, a terrible realization began to form in his mind. Even if the radar had been working perfectly, it couldn't have helped Danny anyway. Mike wiped blood from his eyes and stared at the smoking radar equipment that was supposed to have guided Danny home. The standard N/TPS-1 radar set had been damaged by the artillery blast, its delicate components scattered across the bunker floor like electronic confetti. But more importantly, Mike realized with growing horror that even if the radar had been working perfectly, it couldn't have helped Danny anyway. Mike had grown up with Danny in the steel mills of Pittsburgh, where their father Patrick Sullivan had taught both boys that family meant everything and that you never gave up on someone you loved, no matter how impossible the situation seemed. Their mother, Catherine, had died when Danny was only 12, leaving Patrick to raise 2 boys alone while working double shifts at the homestead works. Brothers look out for each other, Patrick had told them every night before bed. In this world, family is all you got. You remember that when things get tough. Mike, you're the older one. Danny's your responsibility. Danny, you listen to your brother, he's got a good head on his shoulders. Danny was 2 years younger than Mike, but he'd always been the daredevil, the risk-taker, the brother who jumped off railroad bridges into the Allegheny River while Mike calculated the physics of the fall and worried about the currents below. Danny lived for excitement and adventure. Mike lived to keep Danny out of trouble. When Danny announced he was dropping out of high school at 17 to work in the mills, Mike talked him into finishing his education. When Danny got arrested for street racing stolen cars, Mike bailed him out and convinced the judge to give Danny community service instead of jail time. When Danny wanted to marry his 16-year-old girlfriend, Mike talked him into waiting until they were both older and more stable. When the war started, both brothers enlisted immediately, driven by patriotism and the promise of adventure that Danny craved. But they made a pact: they would look out for each other no matter what. Danny became a bomber pilot because he wanted to fly and fight, to be in the thick of the action where he could make a real difference. Mike became a radar technician because he understood electronics and, more importantly, because he wanted to be the guy who brought the flyboys home safe. Especially Danny. For 18 months, Mike had used his radar skills to guide hundreds of Allied aircraft safely back to base, earning a reputation as the best radar operator in the 5th Air Force. He could track aircraft through weather that grounded other missions. He could find lost bombers in atmospheric conditions that made other radar operators give up. He could guide pilots home through interference, storms, and equipment failures that would have meant certain death without his expertise. But now, when it mattered most, when Danny's life hung in the balance, the official equipment had failed completely. Worse than failed, it was fundamentally inadequate for the mission. But now, when it mattered most, when Danny's life hung in the balance, the official equipment had failed completely. The volcanic mountains of Luzon created electromagnetic interference that made standard radar virtually useless for low-altitude search operations. Danny's bomber could be anywhere in a 200-square-mile area of enemy-controlled jungle, and conventional search methods would never find him before Japanese patrols did. Mike looked at his bleeding hands, then at the wreckage of the radar equipment, then at the clock on the bunker wall that showed 0352 hours. If Danny had survived the crash, he had maybe 8 hours before Japanese ground forces would find and capture or kill him and his crew. The official search planes wouldn't resume operations until daylight, and even then, they'd be flying search patterns based on radar technology that couldn't see through the electromagnetic chaos of the volcanic terrain. That's when Mike made the decision that would either save his brother's life or get them both killed. He was going to build a radar system that had never been attempted before, using principles that violated everything he'd learned in radar school, with equipment that wasn't designed to work together, in a damaged bunker while under enemy artillery fire. The impossible radar that broke every rule. Mike's plan was based on something he discovered during his childhood experiments with radio equipment in his father's garage, that different radio frequencies could sometimes penetrate interference that blocked conventional signals, if you knew how to modify the transmission and reception characteristics of the equipment. Standard military radar used high-frequency signals that provided excellent resolution and range under normal conditions, but became useless when volcanic minerals in the mountains created electromagnetic disturbance. Mike's solution was to build a low-frequency radar system that could penetrate the electromagnetic interference, even though every radar expert in the military would have said it was impossible. The technical challenge was enormous. Low-frequency radar required completely different antenna configurations, signal processing methods, and power requirements than the equipment available in the bunker. Mike would have to combine components from damaged radar sets, radio equipment, and even aircraft navigation systems to create a hybrid device that had never been tested under any conditions, let alone combat conditions. But the most dangerous aspect of Mike's plan was that building and operating this improvised radar system would require him to remain in the bunker while Japanese artillery continued to target the position. Every few minutes, shells exploded close enough to shake concrete dust from the ceiling and send new shrapnel fragments spinning through the air. Mike began by salvaging components from 3 different damaged radar sets, extracting the vacuum tubes, transformers, and signal processing circuits that might be adaptable to his low-frequency design. His hands were slippery with blood from the shrapnel cuts, making the delicate electronic work nearly impossible, but he couldn't spare time for medical attention. Every few minutes, he had to pause and wipe blood from his fingers to avoid contaminating the sensitive electronic components. The first major challenge came when Mike tried to remove the magnetron tube from a destroyed APS-15 radar set. The tube was held in place by mounting brackets that had been twisted by the artillery blast, and Mike had to use a crowbar to pry them loose. As he worked, another Japanese shell exploded close enough to rain concrete dust through the damaged ceiling, and Mike felt hot metal fragments whistle past his head. "Come on, you bastard," Mike muttered through gritted teeth as he struggled with the stubborn mounting hardware. The magnetron finally came free, but as Mike lifted it out, he saw that the waveguide had been cracked by the explosion. Without a functional waveguide, the magnetron would be useless for his low-frequency design. Mike's solution was to create a new waveguide using copper tubing salvaged from the bunker's damaged ventilation system. He had to reshape the tubing by hand, hammering it into the precise dimensions needed for optimal signal transmission. The work was painstaking and dangerous. One mistake in the waveguide geometry would make the entire system inoperable. The antenna system was the most critical and dangerous component of Mike's improvised radar. Standard radar antennas were designed for high-frequency operation and would be completely ineffective for the low-frequency signals Mike needed to generate. His solution was audacious and potentially lethal. He was going to use the metal framework of the bunker itself as a giant antenna, connecting copper wires to the steel reinforcement bars embedded in the concrete walls. This meant climbing up into the damaged roof structure while Japanese artillery continued to fall around the position. Mike had to crawl through twisted metal beams and broken concrete, dragging heavy copper cables behind him, while shell fragments and debris rained down from the ceiling. At one point, a shell exploded so close that the entire bunker shook like an earthquake, and Mike had to grab onto a steel beam to keep from falling 20 feet to the concrete floor below. The electrical connections were even more challenging. Mike had to strip insulation from the copper cables using a combat knife, then wrap the bare wire around the steel reinforcement bars in configurations that would create the proper antenna characteristics. Each connection had to be perfect. Any loose wire or poor contact would create interference that would make his radar system useless. As Mike worked desperately on the antenna connections, he could hear radio chatter from the base operations center. Search aircraft were being grounded due to deteriorating weather conditions. The electromagnetic interference from the volcanic mountains was getting worse, making conventional radar completely ineffective. Most ominously, intelligence reports indicated that Japanese ground patrols were increasing their activity in the area where Danny's bomber had disappeared. The power system presented another life-threatening challenge. Low-frequency radar required much more electrical power than standard equipment, and the bunker's power supply had been completely destroyed by the artillery blast. Mike's solution was to connect the radar to the batteries from two jeeps parked outside the bunker, but this meant running heavy electrical cables through the combat zone while under enemy fire. Mike had to make 3 trips outside the bunker, each time exposing himself to Japanese artillery and small arms fire while dragging 50-pound battery cables across open ground. On the second trip, a mortar round exploded close enough to knock him down and fill his mouth with dirt and blood. On the third trip, machine gun fire from Japanese infiltrators forced him to crawl the last 100 yards on his belly, pulling the cables behind him while bullets cracked overhead. By the time Mike had completed the power connections, his uniform was torn and bloody, his hands were cut in a dozen places, and he was dizzy from blood loss and exhaustion. But the improvised radar system was finally ready for testing, and the clock on the bunker wall showed 0458 hours. Danny had been missing for over 2 hours, and every minute that passed decreased the chances of finding him alive. As Mike worked frantically to assemble his improvised radar system, Japanese artillery continued to fall around the position. Several shells landed close enough to knock him off his feet, and one explosion blew out the bunker's windows, filling the air with glass fragments and concrete dust. But the most terrifying moment came when Mike heard the voice of Captain Robert Morrison on the radio, officially declaring Danny's crew missing and presumed dead, and calling off the search until daylight hours. Mike looked at the clock, 0445 hours. Danny had been missing for almost 2 hours, and every minute decreased the chances of finding him alive. The desperate search that defied all odds. At 0503 hours, with his hand still bleeding and Japanese shells exploding every few minutes, Mike activated his improvised radar system for the first time. The collection of salvaged components and improvised antennas began generating low-frequency signals that penetrated deep into the electromagnetic interference that had made conventional radar useless. The first radar sweep revealed nothing but static and interference patterns that looked like electronic snow on the damaged display screen. Mike adjusted the frequency settings, modified the signal processing parameters, and tried again. Still nothing but chaos and electronic noise that could have hidden a dozen crashed bombers. But Mike knew something that the radar manuals didn't teach, that human pattern recognition could sometimes detect signals that automatic processing missed. Instead of relying on the radar's built-in target identification systems, Mike began manually analyzing every blip, every anomaly, every electronic signature that appeared on his improvised display. At 0517 hours, Mike detected something that made his heart stop and his blood turn to ice. A faint metallic reflection, barely distinguishable from background interference, but with characteristics that matched the radar signature of a B-24 bomber. The signal was coming from a location deep in Japanese-controlled territory, almost 20 miles behind enemy lines in an area that official search planes hadn't even covered. Mike's hands were shaking as he adjusted the controls, trying to get a clearer reading. The signal was weak and intermittent, appearing for a few seconds and then disappearing into the electronic noise. For a terrifying moment, Mike thought he'd lost it completely, but then the metallic reflection appeared again, stronger this time, confirming what he desperately hoped but hardly dared believe. It was Danny's bomber. It had to be. Mike checked and rechecked the signal, adjusting his equipment to get the clearest possible reading. The metallic reflection was definitely there, and it was definitely large enough to be a crashed B-24. The radar signature matched the electromagnetic profile of a Liberator bomber, and the location was consistent with the flight path Danny's crew would have taken on their supply drop mission. But the location was a nightmare. The crash site was in the middle of dense jungle that Japanese ground forces were known to patrol regularly. Even worse, the area was surrounded by hills and ridges that would make helicopter rescue extremely dangerous, if not impossible. The next radar sweep confirmed Mike's worst fears and gave him new hope simultaneously. The metallic reflection was stationary, which meant the aircraft had crashed rather than landed safely. But Mike was also detecting multiple small radar signatures around the crash site, human-sized targets that were moving in patterns that could indicate either survivors or enemy patrols. Mike focused the radar beam as tightly as possible, trying to analyze the movement patterns. Some of the signatures were moving randomly, the way injured or disoriented crash survivors might move. But others were moving in organized formations that definitely indicated military patrol activity. Japanese ground forces had found the crash site, or were very close to finding it. If Danny and his crew were still alive, they had minutes, not hours, before capture, torture, or death. Mike grabbed the radio microphone with hands that were shaking from exhaustion, blood loss, adrenaline, and raw terror. His voice cracked as he keyed the transmitter. "Base control, this is Radar Station 7. I have located the missing B-24 bomber. Grid coordinates follow." The response was immediate and skeptical. "Radar 7, this is base control. Confirm you have radar contact on missing aircraft. Our search planes report negative radar contact in that sector. Weather conditions make radar operations impossible in that area." "Base control," Mike replied, his voice growing stronger with urgency and conviction. "I have positive identification of B-24 bomber wreckage at coordinates 14 degrees 35 minutes north, 121 degrees 12 minutes east. Repeat, positive aircraft identification with multiple human targets in immediate vicinity." I am also detecting organized enemy patrol movement toward the crash site. We have maybe 20 minutes before any survivors are captured or killed." There was a long pause before base control responded, and Mike could hear heated discussion in the background. Finally, the radio crackled back to life. "Radar 7, that location is 20 miles behind enemy lines in an area our radar cannot penetrate due to electromagnetic interference from volcanic minerals. Explain how you obtained this target identification. What equipment are you using?" Mike looked at his bleeding hands, at the improvised radar equipment that was held together with wire, determination, and desperate love. He looked at the clock that showed Japanese patrols were probably already within sight of Danny's crash site. He thought about his father's words about never giving up on family, about the promise he'd made to look out for his little brother no matter what. "Base control, I built a radar system that can see through the electromagnetic interference. I used low-frequency transmission with a distributed antenna array to penetrate the volcanic interference that's blocking your high-frequency equipment. The bomber is there, and enemy forces are moving toward the crash site. Sir, that's my brother's crew down there. We have maybe 15 minutes before any survivors are captured or killed. Request immediate rescue mission." The silence that followed seemed to last forever. The rescue mission that tested brotherhood. The debate at base control lasted 17 crucial minutes while Japanese patrols closed in on Danny's position. Colonel James Patterson, commanding officer of the rescue squadron, was reluctant to risk aircraft and crews on a rescue mission based on radar readings from equipment that officially didn't exist and couldn't possibly work under the reported conditions. But Major William Chen, the intelligence officer who had worked with Mike on previous missions, made the argument that changed everything. "Sir, Sergeant Sullivan has guided more aircraft safely home than any radar operator in the Pacific Theater. If he says he's found his brother's bomber, I believe him. And if we don't attempt rescue immediately, we're condemning Danny Sullivan and his crew to death or capture." Colonel Patterson made the decision that would either vindicate Mike's desperate innovation or cost additional American lives. Launch immediate rescue mission. 2 P-51 fighters for air cover, 1 rescue helicopter for extraction. Navigate to coordinates provided by Radar Station 7. Mike remained at his improvised radar station, providing real-time intelligence to guide the rescue mission through the electromagnetic interference that made standard navigation impossible. His radar system was the only equipment that could track both the rescue aircraft and the Japanese patrol movements simultaneously. The rescue helicopter, piloted by Captain Robert "Dusty" McKenzie, had to navigate through 20 miles of enemy territory using only Mike's radar guidance. Mackenzie was a veteran pilot with over 200 combat missions, but he'd never attempted a rescue mission in conditions like these. Standard navigation equipment was useless due to the electromagnetic interference, making the helicopter completely dependent on Mike's improvised system for guidance and threat detection. "Radar 7, this is Rescue 1, Mackenzie's voice crackled through the static. "I'm flying blind out here. Weather's getting worse, and I can't see more than 50 feet in any direction. I need constant guidance to avoid flying into a mountain or into Japanese positions." Mike wiped sweat and blood from his eyes as he focused on his radar screen. The rescue helicopter appeared as a fast-moving blip, threading its way through the mountainous terrain while Japanese patrol signatures moved like deadly spiders across the jungle below. "Rescue 1, you're on course. Maintain heading 127 degrees. Be advised, I'm tracking multiple enemy patrol units between your position and the crash site. You'll need to fly a zigzag pattern to avoid detection." The next 20 minutes were the longest of Mike's life. He had to guide the rescue helicopter through a maze of enemy positions while tracking the movements of Japanese patrols that were closing in on Danny's location from 3 different directions. Every few minutes, Mike had to recalibrate his improvised radar system as components overheated and began to fail from the stress of continuous operation. At 0542 hours, disaster nearly struck when Mike's primary power supply began to fail. The Jeep batteries were draining faster than expected, and the radar screen began to flicker and fade. Mike quickly switched to his backup power system, but he knew he had maybe 15 minutes of operation remaining before complete power failure. "Rescue 1, this is Radar 7, Mike transmitted, trying to keep the desperation out of his voice. "My power supply is failing. I can guide you to the crash site, but I may lose radar contact during your extraction. You'll be on your own for the return flight." Mackenzie's response was immediate and professional. "Understood, Radar 7. Just get me to the crash site. I'll find my own way home if I have to." At 0547 hours, Mike's radar detected the rescue helicopter approaching the crash site, but the tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Japanese patrols were now less than 100 yards from Danny's position and closing fast. Mike could see on his radar screen that enemy forces were moving in a coordinated pattern that indicated they had spotted the crash site and were preparing to capture or kill any survivors. "Rescue 1, this is Radar 7, Mike radioed, his voice tight with tension. "You have enemy patrol movements at 180 degrees, approximately 100 yards from the crash site. Multiple contacts moving toward target location in organized formation. Recommend immediate extraction. Repeat, immediate extraction. Enemy forces are almost on top of the survivors." Captain Mackenzie's voice came back steady and determined. "Radar 7, I have visual contact with crash site. I can see the bomber wreckage and what looks like survivors signaling from a defensive position. Approaching for landing now. This is going to be close." Mike watched his radar screen with growing dread as the rescue helicopter descended toward Danny's position while Japanese patrols converged from three directions like the jaws of a trap closing. The timing was going to be incredibly close, maybe a 1 or 2 minute window for extraction before enemy forces overran the crash site. On his radar screen, Mike could see human-sized targets moving away from the bomber wreckage toward the helicopter landing zone. Those had to be Danny and his surviving crew members. But he could also see Japanese patrol signatures moving rapidly toward the same location from multiple directions. At 0549 hours, Mike's radar detected muzzle flashes as gunfire erupted around the crash site. Japanese patrols had made contact with the survivors and were firing on both the American aircrew and the rescue helicopter. Tracer rounds streaked across Mike's radar screen like deadly fireworks. "Rescue 1, you're taking fire from multiple positions," Mike transmitted urgently. "Enemy contacts at 090, 180, and 270 degrees. Survivors are moving toward your position, but they're under heavy fire." Mackenzie's voice came back strained but determined. "Radar 7, I've got survivors on board, but we're taking heavy fire. One of my crew is hit. Need immediate guidance for extraction route. These bastards are everywhere." At 0551 hours, Mike detected new radar signatures lifting off from the crash site. The rescue helicopter carrying survivors back toward American lines. But his relief was short-lived as Japanese patrol movements indicated that enemy forces had reached the crash site and were probably calling in reinforcements and anti-aircraft weapons. "Rescue 1, this is Radar 7. You have multiple enemy contacts converging on your departure route. Recommend immediate course change to heading 090 degrees to avoid enemy concentrations." The return flight became a deadly game of cat and mouse, with Mike using his radar to guide the rescue helicopter through gaps in Japanese patrol coverage while enemy forces attempted to intercept and destroy the rescue mission. The moment that justified everything. At 0604 hours, the rescue helicopter touched down safely at the American base, and Mike finally allowed himself to believe that his desperate gamble had succeeded. But he couldn't move from his radar station until he was absolutely certain. His improvised equipment was still running on the last few minutes of battery power, and he wanted to make sure no enemy aircraft were pursuing the rescue helicopter. When the all-clear signal came through the radio, Mike finally shut down his radar system and stumbled out of the bunker into the dawn light. His legs could barely support him after hours of intense concentration and blood loss. His hands were so damaged from the shrapnel cuts and electrical burns that he couldn't feel his fingers. But none of that mattered when he saw the helicopter doors open and Danny climbing out under his own power, injured but alive. Danny had a broken arm held in a makeshift sling, multiple cuts and burns from the crash, and a bandage wrapped around his head where he'd been hit by debris. His flight suit was torn and bloody, and he moved with the careful motions of someone fighting pain and exhaustion. But he was conscious, mobile, and unmistakably alive. Mike ran from the radar bunker to meet his brother, still bleeding from his own wounds, still covered in concrete dust and electronic debris from his frantic work on the improvised radar system. The two brothers embraced without speaking, both understanding that they'd just experienced something that would define their relationship for the rest of their lives. "How did you find us?" Danny asked, his voice hoarse from smoke inhalation and shouting over gunfire. The terrain was supposed to be impossible for radar coverage. We were told no rescue was possible until weather cleared. Mike looked back at the damaged bunker where his improvised radar equipment sat silent and smoking, its components burned out from hours of continuous operation beyond their design limits. "I built something that wasn't supposed to work, using parts that weren't designed to go together, because giving up on you wasn't an option." Danny stared at his older brother with new understanding. Blood was still dripping from Mike's hands, and his face was gray with exhaustion and pain. "You mean you invented a new type of radar system just to find me?" "I mean I used everything Dad taught us about never giving up on family, combined with everything I learned about electronics, to build whatever it took to bring you home. The Army gave up on you, Danny. They called off the search. They declared you dead. But I knew you were alive, and I knew you were counting on me to find you." Danny's crew members, Bombardier Lieutenant Tony Ricci, Navigator Sergeant Bill Hayes, and Gunner Corporal Jim Murphy, gathered around the Sullivan brothers. All of them were injured, but all were alive thanks to Mike's impossible radar and Captain Mackenzie's heroic rescue flight. "Your brother saved our lives," Lieutenant Ricci told Mike. "When we crashed, Danny kept saying his brother would find us. We thought he was delirious from the head injury. But he was right. He said you'd never give up on him, no matter what." The success of Mike's improvised radar system had implications far beyond the rescue of one bomber crew. His techniques had proven that conventional assumptions about radar limitations were wrong, and that creative adaptation of existing technology could achieve results that formal research and development had declared impossible. Within hours, radar specialists from throughout the Pacific Theater were examining the wreckage of Mike's equipment and studying his construction notes. The low-frequency approach that Mike had developed proved effective under atmospheric conditions that rendered standard equipment useless, opening new possibilities for radar applications in challenging environments. Colonel James Morrison, the commanding officer who had authorized the rescue mission, personally interviewed Mike about his techniques. "Sergeant Sullivan, what you accomplished here violates several principles of radar theory that I learned in engineering school. According to everything we know about electromagnetic propagation, your system shouldn't have worked." Mike looked at his bandaged hands and thought about the 6 hours of desperate work that had saved his brother's life. "Sir, I didn't have time to worry about theory. I just knew that standard equipment couldn't see through the volcanic interference, so I had to build something that could. The principles aren't that complicated if you understand how radio waves actually behave under different conditions." Morrison shook his head in amazement. "Sergeant, I'm recommending you for immediate promotion and assignment to our radar development program. The techniques you've developed could revolutionize search and rescue operations throughout the Pacific." But for Mike and Danny Sullivan, the technical achievements were secondary to the simple fact that family loyalty and determination had overcome impossible odds. They'd proven that brotherhood could provide the motivation to achieve things that training and equipment alone could never accomplish. Within hours, radar specialists from throughout the Pacific Theater were studying Mike's modifications and construction techniques. The low-frequency approach that Mike had developed proved effective under atmospheric conditions that rendered standard equipment useless, opening new possibilities for radar applications in challenging environments. But for Mike and Danny Sullivan, the technical achievements were secondary to the simple fact that family loyalty and determination had overcome impossible odds. They'd proven that brotherhood could provide the motivation to achieve things that training and equipment alone could never accomplish. The innovation that changed radar forever. Mike Sullivan's desperate improvisation under combat conditions led to fundamental advances in radar technology that influenced military and civilian applications for decades after the war. His demonstration that low-frequency radar could penetrate electromagnetic interference previously thought to be impenetrable opened new areas of research and development. The techniques Mike had developed were formally studied and refined by military researchers, leading to improved radar systems for search and rescue operations, weather monitoring, and terrain mapping applications. His approach to using existing structures as antenna components became standard practice for emergency radar installations. During the Cold War, Mike's innovations influenced the development of radar systems designed to operate under electronic warfare conditions, where enemy jamming and interference made conventional radar ineffective. The principles he had pioneered under combat necessity became core elements of advanced radar technology. The most lasting impact of Mike's work was the demonstration that individual creativity and determination could achieve breakthrough innovations under conditions that formal research programs couldn't replicate. His success inspired a generation of military technicians to experiment with unconventional approaches when conventional equipment failed to meet operational requirements. After the war, Mike used his radar expertise to establish a successful electronics company that developed specialized radar and communications equipment for civilian applications. His company pioneered radar systems for weather forecasting, air traffic control, and maritime navigation that incorporated the interference-resistant techniques he had first developed to save his brother's life. Mike received the Silver Star for his rescue mission innovations, but his most important recognition came from the dozens of aircrew members whose lives were saved by improved radar technology based on his wartime discoveries. The techniques that Mike had developed in desperation became standard equipment that prevented countless aircraft from being lost in bad weather or challenging terrain. Danny Sullivan completed his combat tour and returned to Pittsburgh, where he worked alongside Mike in the family electronics business. The two brothers never spoke publicly about the details of Danny's rescue, but their relationship became a model for how family loyalty and technical skill could combine to overcome seemingly impossible challenges. The human story behind technical innovation. Behind the technical achievements and military recognition of Mike's radar innovations was a deeply personal story that illustrated the power of family bonds and individual determination under extreme stress. The 6 hours that Mike spent building his improvised radar system while under enemy fire, bleeding from shrapnel wounds and driven by the knowledge that his brother's life depended on his success, represented one of the most intense examples of personal motivation driving technical innovation in military history. Mike later described the experience. "I wasn't thinking about radar theory or technical specifications. I was thinking about Danny, about all the times we'd looked out for each other growing up, about how I couldn't face our parents if I didn't do everything possible to bring him home. The electronics were just tools, the real power came from not being willing to give up on someone I loved." The psychological pressure Mike experienced during those crucial hours, working with damaged equipment under enemy fire while knowing that every minute decreased his brother's chances of survival, created conditions that pushed human problem-solving capabilities to their absolute limits. His success demonstrated that extraordinary motivation could enable individuals to achieve things that would be impossible under normal circumstances. The combination of technical knowledge, practical experience, and overwhelming emotional drive produced innovations that formal research programs had never considered. The relationship between Mike and Danny after the rescue illustrated how shared extreme experiences could strengthen family bonds and create mutual understanding that lasted for decades. Danny understood that Mike had risked his own life and violated military regulations to save him. Mike understood that Danny's survival had given meaning and purpose to technical skills that might otherwise have been just professional competence. The rescue mission became a defining moment for both brothers, proving that their father's teachings about family loyalty weren't just sentimental ideas but practical principles that could guide life and death decisions under the most challenging circumstances. The enduring principles of desperate innovation. The broader significance of Mike Sullivan's story extends beyond radar technology to fundamental questions about innovation, problem-solving, and the relationship between emotional motivation and technical achievement. Mike had demonstrated that breakthrough innovations often emerged not from systematic research programs but from desperate necessity combined with relevant technical knowledge and unwillingness to accept conventional limitations. His success was possible because he understood both the theoretical principles of radar operation and the practical skills needed to modify and adapt existing equipment under extreme conditions. The emotional motivation provided by his brother's desperate situation enabled Mike to take risks and attempt solutions that would have been rejected as impossible under normal circumstances. The combination of technical competence and overwhelming personal stakes created conditions where conventional thinking gave way to creative problem-solving. Mike's approach required not just technical knowledge but also the courage to ignore regulations and expert opinions when they conflicted with what needed to be accomplished. His willingness to violate established procedures and attempt untested techniques was driven by the understanding that conventional approaches would result in his brother's death. The principles Mike applied, combining existing technologies in new ways, adapting equipment to specific environmental conditions, and persisting despite repeated failures, proved relevant to many fields beyond military electronics. His story became a model for how individual initiative and creative thinking could achieve results that large-scale research programs had failed to accomplish. Perhaps most importantly, Mike Sullivan had shown that the most powerful innovations often came from people who had personal stakes in solving problems that affected people they cared about. The emotional motivation provided by family relationships could drive technical achievements that pure professional competence might never attempt. So here's the question Mike's story poses: what would you be willing to attempt if someone you loved depended on your success? How far beyond your normal capabilities could you reach if conventional approaches weren't sufficient to save someone who mattered to you? And what innovations might be possible if you combined your technical knowledge with the kind of desperate determination that makes giving up impossible? Mike Sullivan proved that sometimes the most sophisticated technology is no match for a brother's love, a willingness to ignore the rules when they're inadequate, and the refusal to accept that some problems are unsolvable when family is on the line.